Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste, Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, good morning, or good night to all of you. We are so pleased to have so many people in this meeting from all over the world in different time zones. I am Shakira Mohammed from Trinidad and Tobago, a teacher for the past 15 years. And we are indeed fortunate to be celebrating unity and diversity in Trinidad and Tobago this weekend. And in other countries also, we have the Hindu Festival of Color or Holi or Pagua. In Trinidad, we have the Spiritual Shouter Baptist Liberation Day that was celebrated yesterday. Today, Easter Sunday, commemorates the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And also Ramadan is being observed by Muslims through fasting and prayers. So how is this diversity reflected in our Constitution is what we will discuss in a few minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our 201st edition of our Zoom public meeting. And we wish to sincerely thank all of you who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora Global Project. For 200 unbroken continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday, and we're looking forward to making the next century. And in the past 3 years, 10 months, and 1 week, we have featured 845 presenters from all parts of the world speaking on 200 topics. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, a legally registered research and publishing company operating since 2010. And in order to continue this weekly program and to make it bigger and better, we are kindly asking for your suggestions, volunteers, as well as donations, and you can contact Dr. Kumar Mahavir for details. So I'll introduce our moderator for this evening session, who is Shalama Mohammed, the co-director of this Zoom platform, who is a business teacher and researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. She obtained her master's degree in business psychology from Franklin University in the USA. Shalama, welcome.
Thank you so much, Shakir. Assalamu alaikum, namaste. We truly appreciate you all choosing to be here with us from the various time zones in which you live. This program is being live streamed on the YouTube channel of the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center. So I want to say welcome to all of you on YouTube at this time. We are also recording live, and the recording will be uploaded later on YouTube permanently for posterity. As a result, please be advised that your mic has been muted. To our speakers, in order to avoid intrusions from trolls, please do not admit anyone, do not unmute anyone, and do not allow anyone to share your screen, please. We appreciate your cooperation. Over the next 2 hours, our panel of esteemed speakers will be presenting on constitutional reform in multi-ethnic democracies in the Indian diaspora. Constitutional reform or constitutional amendment refers to the process of making changes to the fundamental legal framework that governs a nation. This can involve adding, removing, or modifying specific provisions to adapt to societal, political, or legal changes over time. Several decades ago, the governments in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago had expressed their intentions to consider fundamental amendments to their respective constitutions. Those intentions have materialized now, with both governments appointing advisory committees to take action on that long-promised goal. Some of the issues to be considered are the roles of the presidency and the judiciary, as well as the death penalty, proportional representation, and other aspects of the system of governance. Following the death of former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago on January 1st, 2024, Dr. Basil Pandey, Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley responded to the clarion call by the public to honor Dr. Pandey's legacy by reforming the Constitution. Within weeks, he mandated the establishment of a National Advisory Committee comprising 7 experienced citizens of distinction, one of whom is Mr. Nizam Mohammed, whom we are honored to have address you later in the program. To elicit the views of a wide cross-section of the citizenry, including the diaspora, and to make recommendations for reform of the Constitution at a national consultation in June 2024. That's the mandate of this particular National Advisory Committee. In multi-ethnic democracies in the Indian diaspora, constitutional reform takes on added complexity due to the diverse racial, cultural, and religious nature of the societies. It often involves navigating intricate power dynamics among different ethnic groups, to ensure equitable representation that aims to foster diversity, quality, and inclusion, as well as to address certain historical injustices. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear from our first speaker now. And this is Mr. Jairam Nair of Canada. He's originally from South Africa. He's the former anti-apartheid and trade union activist and chairperson of the UFCW Ontario Provincial Council Anti-Racism and Human Rights Committee. Welcome, Jay. You can go ahead with your presentation. 15 minutes. You're unmuted.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks to the ICC, the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, for allowing me to speak at this forum. My way of looking at it, of the constitutional changes, is through my experience over the years at in South Africa and in Canada. Now I'm trying to start at the next slide, please, with the land acknowledgement, and this is part of what I learned recently and what we use in all our opening meetings. As a second-generation indentured Indian from South Africa, I am on the lands of Mississauga, which is part of the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of the Huron-Wendat and Wyandot nations. I recognize these peoples and their ancestors as peoples who inhabited these lands since time immemorial. In line of the horrific discoveries made at the sites of former residential schools and the complicated history of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples, I remain more committed than ever to strengthen my relationship and ours with the Indigenous neighbors through action. I commit to read the Government of Canada's TRC report, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the 94 calls to action. And that is why this land acknowledgement is to respect the land that I am on. I am therefore privileged to be living in the city of Mississauga, which is home to many global Indigenous peoples. I thank them for allowing me to be part of the city in Canada, Megwitch. Next slide, please. Now, reason I started here is this is where we all originated from. And India has, according to the democratic principles, one of the most democratic constitutions to date. But recently, with things happening in India, it's not in that realm of being one of the best. And after the Congress Party that developed the constitution over their years, and now we've got the new conservative government in the country that's chopping and changing. So I leave that for another day. Next slide, please. Now, I hail from South Africa, born a native of South Africa, of Indian origin through ancestry, which is my father and my grandfather, who were indentured people that came to the country. Next slide, please. Now, this is, I'm showing this to show how the different colonial powers transported the Indians as indentured laborer to the colonies that they ruled over. And how did they get those colonies? And you'll find that in 1834, the slaves were, the abolition of slavery happened, and then they needed a new sort of labor force. And the labor force was Indians, and maybe Chinese, maybe Indonesians, and other racial groups. Next slide, please. Now here, this is where the start of the problem. The doctrine of discovery in 1493 was a papal bull issued by Pope Alexander VI on May 4th, 1493, which played a central role in the Spanish conquest of the New World. The Pope authorized Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas and its native peoples as subjects using religion. The decree asserts the rights of Spain and Portugal to colonize, convert, and enslave. It also justifies the enslavement of Africans and the indigenous peoples in all the colonies that they ruled over. Next slide, please. Now, what is democracy? The root, a government by the people, especially ruled by the rule of majority. And B, a government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation, usually involving periodically held free elections. Next slide, please. What are the principles of democracy? The Democratic Charter defines the essential elements of representative democracy in very specific terms, including respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, holding free and fair elections, a pluralistic system of political parties and organizations, separation of powers, independence of the branches of government. Next slide shows how we as citizens, as part of the citizenry, accommodate diversity in a plural society. This inclusiveness must be based on the values of justice, democracy, tolerance, respect of diversity, and rule of law that are not only accepted by all different ethnic communities, but that establish for all communities a new, a stronger identity, making possible a solidarity among the different communities. Now, these are the basis of a democratic system of government in a nation. Next slide, please. What makes a good citizen? Coming from that angle where we fit as people from the Indian diaspora into this global village. Some important concepts that help make up civic virtue include self-sacrifice, most important. Putting the needs of a community over one's own needs is one of the most deeply rooted parts of civic virtue. And I know and I experience this tremendously in my family, and I know how it works. Participation. Participation in government and in the community is part of what makes one a good citizen. That I didn't enjoy, but I participated as an individual citizen in South Africa and in Canada through the background of a political party. Next slide, please. My suggestions, and there may be millions of suggestions out there and in the panel today, get involved, be involved, educate yourself, get to know your constitution, if there is one, know the laws that are in your country, your state, your province, your municipality, or town board. Get to know the rules and regulations to adhere to. Join a group, a club, a community. Be the leader. Question if you do not know. Get involved with your representative. And now this is the representative in the democratic government that represents your viewpoints. And the most important is go and vote on election day. Because if you don't vote, you have no reason to complain. Next slide, please. Now, here's my background. All the leaders of the Congress Alliance in South Africa, and this is just a handful. These are the main leaders. And there were others who were members, like my brother. And you've got Dr. Monty Naika, Dr. Yusuf Dadu, Nelson Mandela. Farouk Mir is on the left of Monty Naika. Monty Naika is center. And on the right of Monty Naika is Enti Naika, all executive of the Congress Alliance. Next slide. Now, this is the backbone of the South African Constitution, and I'm working with the Constitution of South Africa and the Constitution of Canada. And you can see right at the beginning, I hope it's visible, we, the people of South Africa, declare for all our country and the world to know. And there are so many concepts that came to being. The people shall govern. I've got the bigger print, and that's available for copies for people who are talking constitutional change. All national groups shall have equal rights. The people shall share in the country's wealth, which is most important. The land shall be shared among those who work it. All shall be equal before the law. All shall enjoy equal human rights. There shall be work and security. The doors of learning and of culture shall be opened. There shall be houses, security, and comfort. There shall be peace and friendship. This is in a nutshell of what is in the Freedom Charter. And this was adopted in 1955. And you can see how the Congress Alliance, with the help of the Indians from the Indian movement that started with Mahatma Gandhi in 1894, brought to the table ideas and concepts and living conditions for the general citizenry. And we played a major part. But today, it's not in that realm where we are playing a major part in the country that was freed in 1994. Then, next slide, please. Now we are jumping into the Canadian realm of my experience and work. Being involved in human rights through the labor movement and negotiations and so on and so forth, I had to get to know what our Constitution is, what our labor laws are, and what happened in 1982. We brought the Constitution from England, the 1867 charter that freed Canada and let us govern ourselves. Upper and Lower Canada became one. And we adopted a new Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And with regards to this is something that I sent a copy for anybody that wants a print of that, will be able to get it from the ICC. And if not, you can find it online, Government of Canada. And here you will see things that we did in the 90s, where we had to negotiate these things into our Human Rights Act, Human Rights Codes, and the Charter of Rights is the backbone of, just like the Freedom Charter was the backbone of the South African Constitution, we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which also embodies a lot of fundamental ideas and freedoms that the citizenry wanted and needed. And this is all with consultation with the different people. And next slide, please. Now, what is the difference between the Constitution Act of 1867 and 1982? Rather than being an entirely new constitution, the 1982 Act is an amendment of the 1867 BNA Act, renamed Constitution Act, 1867, and keeps the same governmental structure in place, which came from the British system. The executive authority is still formally vested in the Queen and exercised by the Governor General. But recently, you will all must have followed that certain parts of the Commonwealth have become free, have declared themselves a republic. And the most recent one was Barbados. That's become a free nation. So the people have to be involved. And that's the only way you can get amendments. And I gave you some tidbits of how things are done and how I got involved with the process and tried to make amendments. And even to this day, I'm trying to, as a senior, trying to amend the Healthcare Act of Ontario, which is a mirror of the Canada Health Act. And we want protections for the seniors. What has happened? The conservative governments have done this. They've forgotten about the seniors as long as they can institutionalize them, put them into warehouses just to go. And the COVID situation really brought out the worst of these institutions. And I, for my part, I was a representative for the health office and professional sector of my union. And I used to service these nursing homes and homes for the aged and retirement homes. And I used to visit and see conditions at which I can't do because I can't question because I was representing the workers. But the workers used to complain, Jay, this is wrong, that is wrong, that. I said, I can't do a thing. I have to protect you. But today, as a senior, I don't want to end up in those senior homes. So we have a group that is putting pressure on the government to try to say, we want to stay in place. That means if I am in my home, I don't want to be declared an invalid or a disabled person, and I have to be sent to a home about 100 kilometers away from my home that I own, and which I put my blood, sweat, and tears into. So that is ongoing, and we are trying to change the thinking. And continue with that is the executive authority is formally vested in the Queen and exercised by the Governor General. So having said that, I leave it with I'm sure the others who are after me will be bringing out certain things that can be done. But this is my experience. I say, be involved, get involved, and make your voices heard. And if you don't do that, don't complain when the government comes in and does things. That'll be too late. So be there first and ask for the amendments. And there's other things that I could speak about where I have my views about certain types of government, certain types of, exercises in government. And with that, next slide, please. Now,
Jay,
that covered my whole journey.
Jay, let's have you give us your closing comments, please.
Yeah, that's in light of what I have outlined, I leave it to the rest of the presenters to what you call delve deeper into this, and I will be prepared to answer any questions that come up as we go along. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope my 2 cents are in order.
Yeah,
Thank
wonderful.
You.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a good introduction. And thank you very much for sharing your personal story with us. So, ladies and gentlemen, we will take your questions and comments at the end of all of the presentations. If you don't mind, kindly hold those questions off of the chat. We will welcome your comments in the chat, and please let them be kind. Let's take our second speaker now. This is Dr. Venkat Iyer of the UK. He's originally from India. He's a practicing barrister, former law commissioner, mediator, and academic based in Northern Ireland, attached to Ulster University, where he teaches constitutional law, business law, and media law. Welcome, Dr. Iyer. You're muted.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and can also offer my greetings to everybody else on the panel. I'm going to try to keep to the 15 minutes that have been allocated, and I'm not going to use any PowerPoint slides. I'll speak extempore, probably in a slightly disjointed way, but I hope you'll excuse me for that. And my talk is actually going to be more nuts and bolts in terms of constitutional reform, because I've been involved in a number of jurisdictions, not necessarily the diaspora nations, although a few of them did actually invite me to be part of their journey. We are talking, of course, of a very disparate group of nations when we're talking about Indian diaspora nations. So on the one hand, you would have long-established Western democracies, the UK, Australia, US, Canada, New Zealand, etc. And then, of course, you have the subcontinental countries, Sri Lanka, India, etc. And in Southeast Asia, you have Malaysia, Singapore. Not to mention, of course, further afield, we have the Pacific Islands, the Caribbean countries, the Gulf countries, which has a significant Indian diaspora, and also, of course, South Africa. Now, in terms of constitutional reform, which is the theme of today's talk, I suppose the first thing to say is that constitutional reform is multifaceted, and it's quite a complex process as well. It involves many factors, many motivations, many drivers. Some of the motivations may be innocuous, well-intentioned, even noble. But it is also possible for certain motivations to be pernicious for the purposes of bad social engineering, even malicious. The other thing about constitutional reform is that it could be either evolutionary, as happens in countries like the United Kingdom, or it could be revolutionary. Fortunately, the revolutionary type of constitutional reform happens very infrequently. So if we are looking at an example, we could think about what happened in Fiji. And of course, it is possible for constitutional reform to be very opportunistic, for example, to win elections. So these are factors which we need to keep in mind when we're talking about constitutional reform. We also need to distinguish between the substance of reform and the process through which it is to be achieved. Sometimes the former may be good and the latter bad. The other point I would make at the outset is that hasty reform is usually disastrous. So there's always a case to be made for long-term thinking and planning. I would also venture to make another point which probably may not be very popular, and that is that that is in the form of a general principle, which is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. In other words, change for change's sake is not, in my opinion, a good thing. Those who are proposing change must show a strong justification for it. It has sometimes been put in a pithy adage to the effect that if it's not necessary to change, it is necessary not to change. And of course, we have to recognize that disputes are unavoidable in most societies. and they should not be mistaken for a failure of the constitutional arrangements in those societies. And sometimes the status quo, even if it has served a country well, may not be to the liking of certain people, whether in the majority or in the minority. And that also triggers calls for reform. I would say as well that another principle which is worth keeping in mind is that bad reform is worse than no reform. Therefore, in many cases, it may be better for people to put up with some inconveniences than to let hasty or unworkable reforms be effected. It's my view as well that generally speaking, constitutions should be seen as long-lasting documents which should not be tinkered with too frequently. Otherwise, not only will there be a political instability, but in the long term, people's confidence in the system will be shaken. In countries where there's a tradition of respect for constitutional conventions, the process of constitutional reform is usually smoother and less fractious. So the point I'm making is that too much codification is not necessarily effective. And again, in terms of my preliminary remarks, I suppose I could say that there is usually a lot of give and take in genuinely well-intentioned constitutional reform. No one should come to the table with inflexible attitudes, although, of course, adherence to certain core values and principles is certainly desirable. Now, this begs the question, what is the purpose of a constitution? I'm not going to give a theoretical lecture on this, just to indicate that it's essentially, in a practical sense, to confer legitimacy on political decisions so that those decisions will be accepted by most of the population, including those who may not be happy with them. The constitution should therefore provide mechanisms for the unhappiness to be redressed, or at least contained, for example, through free and fair periodic elections, so that those seeking alternative decisions or policies will have a chance of electing a party which will enact such policies. But of course, there must be some core non-negotiable values in all constitutions, which include guaranteed fundamental rights. I would say that even with fundamental rights, constitutions usually couch them in general terms, and their ambit is left to be decided in the first place by the legislature and then by the judiciary. Which then brings me to the importance of an independent, competent, and well-resourced judiciary. I would say, first of all, that no constitution, however well-crafted, can succeed unless there is a truly independent judiciary to interpret it wisely. This is separate, of course, from the other important principle that is frequently cited, namely that a constitution is only as good as the people who operate it. Judges, I would say, should never be chosen on principles other than merit, because judges should neither be unwilling to assert themselves where necessary, nor overly active. The law should not be seen and used as politics by other means. Generally speaking, the judiciary should respect the separation of powers and accept that it is elected representatives of the people who should make policy. They should only step in when proper procedures are not followed or constitutionally guaranteed rights are violated. This means that the mechanisms for selection of judges and, of course, for the resourcing of the judiciary must be fair, reasonable, and robust. Even though courage in individual judges is to be commended, there is a need to recognize that the judiciary is the weakest arm of government, and therefore we have to accept that its authority rests on sustained public confidence in its moral sanction. One other issue that comes up frequently in the context of constitutional reform is the balance to be achieved between majoritarianism and minority rights. This is usually a central issue in constitutional reform in countries with significant ethnic, religious, linguistic, or other minorities. And of course, it's very relevant to Indian diaspora countries. Sometimes new dimensions are brought into the calls for minority protection. For example, the introduction of caste as a protected characteristic. These, I think, have the tendency to lead to atomization of population groups. Now, it's possible that when I say this, I'm being controversial, but that is my sincere view. The law, I think, is a blunt instrument and should only be used where it's absolutely necessary. In other words, we should, if possible, explore other ways of bringing about reform. And that would mean relying on education, persuasion, and where unavoidable, even peer pressure, including sometimes naming and shaming. Another contentious issue which is often encountered in these debates is to what extent should any emphasis be given to responsibilities, for example, of minorities, as well as rights. So these are some of the more difficult questions that we need to keep in mind. And just a word about frequently used constitutional mechanisms to resolve majority-minority tensions. First of all, of course, you have guaranteed fundamental rights, which should be subject to judicial review. It's possible to think about proportional representation for elections to parliament, to provincial legislatures, etc. But of course, the downside is that they tend to lead to coalitions. Some countries have experimented with reservation of seats in parliament, for example, Pakistan or Lebanon. And the downside of that is that there can be fragmentation of populations and an erosion of national unity. Power sharing is also sometimes used, and a prime example of that is in the country where I live, Northern Ireland. Mutual vetoes in matters affecting the rights and interests of the major population groups can also be helpful, but only up to a point. Sometimes the highest offices of state are reserved for representatives of the main religious or ethnic communities. This, I fear, may breed long-term resentment. And of course, there's the other solution of federalism, with autonomy for provincial units, which may consist of particular population groups. Referenda have sometimes been used for reforms in contentious areas which affect particular population groups. And of course, there is the other technique of using public funding for educational institutions which are organized on religious, ethnic, or linguistic basis. But I would say that if this is adopted, then it has to be fair and even-handed. I'll probably conclude with just a couple of observations about what may be called major or big-ticket issues in constitutional reform. I'm talking now at macro level. So you would first of all have to think about the merits and demerits of parliamentary versus presidential systems. Along with that, you might also talk about whether you want a unicameral or a bicameral system, whether you want a written or unwritten constitution. I don't think there's much debate on that point because there are not too many countries with unwritten constitutions. If you do have a written constitution, should it be rigid? Should it be flexible? A more fundamental question sometimes that is posed is, should you follow civil law or common law? Now, of course, most of the diaspora countries follow common law because of their British heritage. A further debate sometimes is, should the system have a monist or a dualist character in terms of acceptance of international law? The separation of powers is usually a contentious issue. Likewise, whether the constitution should be secular or whether it should recognize a state religion. What about the use of referenda, or should decisions be left to general elections? And of course, in some countries, the question is sometimes put about to what extent should customary law be recognized in relation to other kinds of law. I fear I am reaching the end of the time allocated to me, so I will probably stop there. But if there's anything else that comes up during our discussion, I'll be only too happy to talk about them. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. You were on point with your time, and it was quite a thought-provoking presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we look forward to the audience having questions as well as members of our panel. Thank you very much, Dr. Aya. So ladies and gentlemen, let's have our third speaker now, and this is Dr. Kusha Harak Singh from Trinidad. He's a former historian from the University of the West Indies and founding dean of the Faculty of Law, former senator in our parliament, and CARICOM and CARIForum lead negotiator for legal and institutional issues. Welcome, Dr. Harak Singh. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Shalima. May I begin by congratulating the organizers on reaching a major milestone of 200 odd of these events. This is an astounding achievement, and congratulations are richly deserved. And may I say good day or good night, as the case might be, to the various observers and participants in this session. I'm happy to see quite a number of names of people that I know or have met or interacted with in one way or another on the event today. I will, as I suppose is relevant for a 200 event situation, to take a very broad view of the matter. And I will do so by taking a broad view of the topic and also by making a very broad assertion. The broad view stems from the fact that, as we all know, 1 person in every 5 in the world today is an Indian or of Indian descent, and they are not all in India, but they're spread across the world, as one of the previous speakers has said. It used to be thought for a while that Indians were a stay-at-home people, but of course that was never true. From Buddhist monks in the ancient period to missionaries, to soldiers, to statesmen, missionaries, travelers, scholars, the movement of Indians overseas is one of the broad movements of mankind. It's cut a swath across a whole range of human settlements, those with indigenous populations, those without, and it has changed civilization in very astounding ways. Perhaps the best way to capture this is by referring to the letter that Mahatma Gandhi, he was not yet Mahatma, wrote to the indentured Indians when he was leaving South Africa, saying that they will be forever in his debt, because it was among them that he developed his great technique of passive resistance and civil disobedience. A kind of tribute that he paid to Indians overseas, especially to indentured Indians, which is often overlooked. But it is that tribute that encapsulates this great movement, which was developed by the followers of Martin Luther King, as we all know, which saw many of them going to ashrams in India to further develop the technique, to practice it in America, to change the Voting Rights Act in the United States, to lead eventually, I would say in a straight line, to the election of President Obama as the President of the United States, directly from Indian immigrants to the President of the United States. I make that bold assertion to show the great achievement and the great effect that the Indian diaspora has and can have. And the reason for this is because my second bold assertion, that some of the major movements of the contemporary world, those which have to do with the mingling of diasporas, those which have to do with migration and emigration, these are the big burning events of the modern world, and these are events in which the Indian diaspora has played a significant role, and in fact has the ability to show communities all over the world some of the resolutions that are possible. In every big city in the world and not so big cities now, the dividing characteristic is the mingling of diasporas as they jostle against each other and how to resolve the tensions which arise in that kind of jostling. I remember an event in England. It was not about Indians. It was in fact about an African mother who carved tribal marks on a child's face, was arrested for the crime of grievous bodily harm. But the judge in England made the remark that England was the newest of plural societies. And so, although he found her guilty, he did not exactly punish her. This notion of diversity, being able to change a law, being able to influence how judges think, is extremely important. It, in fact, influenced, I think, although it hasn't seen its culmination, the way in which Prince Charles, as he then was seeing himself. He said that if he were to become king, he would drop the title Defender of the Faith, because in England there were now many faiths. We have yet to see if that promise will be kept. So that's my broad overview. And the uniting thing, which was somewhat prefaced by some of the points that Dr. Iyer made in his basket of concerns that we need to take into account in shaping constitutional change, is arise precisely because of this juxtaposing of peoples from different parts of the world in a single space. And mind you, it's not only about juxtaposing people of different ethnicities, but even among Indians themselves, there was a juxtaposing, because as we all know, Indians from all parts of India came, let's say, to the Caribbean. I have used the phrase in one of my writings, which I call collapse space, the force of collapse space, how Indians from the broad subcontinent are brought to a small space in Trinidad and have to jostle with each other for status and dominance and for an eventual resolution of their differences. So now to move to what we are supposed to do in constitutions. One of the major problems with constitutions starts at the very beginning with the preamble, because constitutions are supposed to represent the spirit of a people. But what is to happen if there is no people, or if there's a collection of peoples? Then how is that spirit to be encapsulated? We've had problems lately, gender problems, because our constitution in Trinidad, for example, says all men must be equal. It didn't mention women at the time when it was written. So that's one issue about preambles. They are sometimes glossed over. People think of preambles as, well, something we wouldn't pay too much attention to because the meat is really in the articles that follow. But a modern approach is that preambles are extremely important to capture not only the spirit of the people, to capture the ethos, to capture what, as in the Constitution of India, the judges have now said, is the basic structure doctrine. And how to get that spirit, how to get that uniformity, how to get that arrangement that everybody will agree to, something that Dr. Iyer and Jay also presented as the core principles. But there are difficulties with these core principles. My colleague my panelist, co-panelist, Mr. Nizam Mohammed, will remember an event in Trinidad when a former Minister of Education, in an attempt to arrive at something core, something that everybody could agree to, thought that it might be useful to have a common school prayer. He was, as it turned out, the brother of the Archbishop, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Trinidad, and he started his prayer with the phrase, "O God, our Father." And it never went any further because it floundered on that fourth word of God as Father, because that was not common to everybody. So there are difficulties in trying to capture this essential spirit. And my view is that that would be not a starting point to be glossed over, but a starting point to be a point of full engagement in order to find that spirit. As I said, in the Indian constitution, the judges talk about basic doctrine, as a kind of filter, so that laws which are passed must pass through that filter before they are accepted as valid laws. In some constitutions, like for example ours in Trinidad and Tobago, there are hurdles to be crossed before a law can be passed. One of which might be a special majority. Another might be this idea that the law must not be such that a country that has a proper respect for good governance will allow. So there are various kinds of filters that can be used. And in my view, these must be built into any new constitution. Now, one of the important things about Indians overseas is that they generally live in democracies where the rule of law is important. And Indians themselves are a kind of people who would say that they are committed to the rule of law. This is sometimes a protective device because you don't have the force to do otherwise. So you have to depend on the force of the law. But rule of law means or raises the question of what law, and therefore it becomes important. How is the law made? How is the law interpreted? And how is the law implemented? And these three important things, I think, are three important variables that must be fully explored in any new constitution or any new constitutional arrangement. So how is the law made? It's of course made by those who are elected to power in parliament. And one of the things here we have to come to terms with is that both in the former British colonies, but also in the French and sometimes the Danish colonies, these colonies suffered from what we may call the debris of colonialism. That is, the colonial powers experimented overseas in ways in which they would never experiment at home. And so we've had, as Dr. Aya mentioned, various kinds of arrangements with entrenched provisions or with uh, communal electorates or with reserve seating and so on. These are important issues that have somehow to be either fully elaborated or discarded, or somehow some kind of arrangement to be found where what those arrangements were seen to be protecting might in fact be protected, but in different ways. So how, for example, are we to deal with constituencies in countries like, say, Trinidad or Jamaica, where the constituency boundaries are just drawn in a kind of historical fashion that has no meaning, or might in fact, in a very minute way, represent the kind of partition that took place in India, where a dividing line is drawn between fields or between villages or sometimes through the village itself, as we have in some constituencies here in Trinidad, that absolutely make no sense, but are part, as I say, of the debris of civilization. So the question of how is a government to be elected and the rules for that election are important features to be gauged in any new constitution. And this raises to the question of campaign financing, which is an important issue. We've seen it in India recently with the debate over what's called election bonds, about how donations are made to political parties and whether or not they must be kept secret or whether or not they should be exposed to the general public to know who is funding what. So those are some issues about the question of who makes the law. Then the question of who interprets it. Dr. Iyer did mention the importance of judges as interpreters of the law. In my own teaching, I taught jurisprudence, and I was often confronted with this view of an American jurist who said that the words in a constitution are all empty vessels in which we pour our own meaning. So they have the constitution are words on paper, like a religious text. They have to be interpreted. And therefore, the question of who does the interpretation is extremely important. Who are these people and how are they appointed? In one of my experiences, I was chairman of the CARICOM Competition Commission, and I had the opportunity to attend the swearing in of the president of the Caribbean Court of Justice in St. Kitts, which is where the event was taking place. The moderator for that event was the CARICOM lawyer, who happened to be a woman and happened to be a Muslim wearing a Muslim headdress. The president, who was being inaugurated, was felicitated by his pastor from his village, who said to him I hope when you are appointed, you would follow the rules in the good book. This person was to be president of the Caribbean Court of Justice. And it did not occur to the pastor that there were many good books in the Caribbean and not just one good book, because it was a kind of accepted notion that there's one kind of rule, one kind of ethos, one kind of moral and spiritual value, which is a phrase that got us into great trouble in Trinidad, in got us about 10 or 15 years ago in great trouble in Trinidad and Tobago, when it served as a filter to elect a prime minister or to choose a prime minister. Now, who, in fact, are these judges and how they are appointed is, I think, an important point, and important too in relation to the assertion, to the observation that Dr. Iyer made about whether judges should make law or whether that should be left to the elected representatives. We do have this debate, especially at a time when judicial review has become an important feature of constitutions, because judges are the ones to judicially review the actions of administration officials, or sometimes the actions of politicians. And this is a live debate that we can't hope to resolve today, but it is important. Another important feature that I would think that we have to contend ourselves with is this notion that stemmed from the arrangements that were put in place for elections, known as the winner takes all syndrome. And it is related, therefore, to the question that Dr. Iyer raised of power sharing and to the kind of arrangements, for example, that we see in Northern Ireland, that was in the news for other reasons yesterday or the day before, when the leader of one of the parties announced his resignation. But power sharing is a big issue, and how is power to be shared, if at all, between those who have won the elections and those who were unfortunate not to win. And there's a point here about the word proportionality that becomes important, because it is a feature of modern legal thinking, how to resolve differences by using the notion of proportionality. What is the least harmful way of resolving a particular issue? So the question, the third one I said, was who implements, not who makes the law, who interprets the law, and who implements. And here we have a major problem in relation to the constitutions that we have, because the implementers are people who might be appointed by the government in power, might have their own views about how the implementation is to take place. But more importantly, where diasporic Indians are concerned, the implementation, which might sometimes seem well-meaning, might have a differential impact on the Indian community. Just to take some examples to make this point, to anchor this point. If you have a government, for example, that believes that the most vulnerable group in society are single female household leaders, or households in which there's a single female who is the head of the household. And therefore, special attention must be given to those kinds of households, because that could be a breeding ground for crime or deprivation or poverty and so on. And let's suppose the government then diverts attention in that area. But you have a community that does not believe in single female heads of households and tries to keep the marriage together, tries to keep a family unit together. That group might feel hard done by if the money is diverted to another area. Or to take another example, if you spend your time acquiring property and acquiring a home, and you are a property owner, but the government believes that special attention should be given to people who rent or renters, then the property owner might feel hard done by. Although the law itself might be neutral in the sense of when it is passed, but in the implementation, the differential impact on different groups would become obvious. So this is an important point that constitutional change would have to deal with, how to handle that differential impact. I think I'm coming to the end of my time, so I will just say that the challenges posed by the scattering of peoples and the need to determine how the resources of the state must be distributed are important events. For the Indian community itself, the challenges posed by the scattering was important because it did one thing. It showed them the possibilities of the diaspora as a liberator, and to be able, therefore, to discard certain elements of their heritage and to choose others. And indeed, some have been discarded as, for example, the most fundamental views about the treatment of women or the most fundamental views about caste. These have been jettisoned. And what has been embraced and should continue to be embraced are the virtues of the diaspora as liberator, in which new things are possible, in which new frontiers are available to be crossed. Just how new and just how much will be crossed will, of course, be to be seen in the expanse of time. Thank you very much. I would be all too happy to answer any questions or observations that the presenters might have, that the audience might have.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Harak Singh. Thank you so much for your several enlightening assertions and a call to address the contemporary issues that actually face us. So we will hold those questions though until our next speaker has ended. So thank you very much again. I will now ask Mr. Nizam Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago to unmute. He's an 83-year-old London-educated lawyer, still in practice for more than 5 decades. He's a former member of parliament as well as Speaker of the House of Representatives in Parliament. Recently, as I would have stated earlier, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago announced that Mr. Mohammed will serve in the National Advisory Committee to make recommendations for changes to our constitution and for that national consultation in June. So welcome, Mr. Mohammed. Can you unmute your mic? Dr. Mahabir, can you?
Yes, I am trying for him to allow him to unmute, but I don't know what is happening.
Zahira, are you able to unmute? Okay, while we sort that out, I think what I will do is ask a few members of the audience who would like to pose questions to please raise your electronic hands. You can go to the reactions button at the base of your screen. In there, you will see an electronic hand. Please click on it, and then I will be able to call on you to ask your question. Okay, and we have our first raised hand from Dr. Bala from England. Go ahead, please. Dr. Bala, you are unmuted. Would you like to turn on your video as well? We're not hearing you as yet.
He's trying, but not succeeding. So I see Dr. Ganga is ready and Keshavi.
Yes. So Dr. Ganga Ramdas, would you be able to unmute, please?
Yes,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Jay had said that land should be shared among those who work the land. Now, he also mentioned land acknowledgement. So I'm thinking that the land acknowledgement should include land ownership. And in particular, I'm looking at the sugar lands. These lands are sitting there while we have our native populations that are not being considered. The political elites, they are looking for multinationals and other special business class people to allocate, assign, and to work the land. So I'm thinking that in terms of fairness and future constitutional reforms, we should have a special set aside for native peoples so that they can be self-employed, they can do farmings, and they can uh, cultivate with their families in the way that they know best, as they have done traditionally. So generally, what's happening, the native peoples are pushed to the marketplace to acquire land, whereas the new elites, they are given non-market allocations of land. I think that the Constitution needs reform in this area when it comes to land ownership. Land must be viewed as a form of capital. We were born with our hands and feet. Labor, I to labor and they to leisure. We need to change that paradigm. So we need to change the property rights structure in favor of native peoples. Otherwise, we're going to have a population exchange, and it will not be in terms of those who work the land. So those are my comments, and I'd like Mr. J. Neer to make some comments, and anyone else who would like to do that. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramdas. Jay, can you unmute, please?
Thanks for acknowledging the acknowledgement. That is in particular with the Indigenous people of Canada. And I thought that the Commonwealth countries were also thinking of adopting some type of land acknowledgement. Now, that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which came out with 94 points that we have to adhere to, which was all with the churches involved and the doctrine of discovery and so on and so forth. That land acknowledgement is to respect the Indigenous nations of Canada. And we have Indigenous nations, the whole of North America. The United States hasn't come out with a land acknowledgement agreement, but we are following it, and that is just to say that they are part and parcel of the country, and they can be also taken into account when they go into labor, go into all branches of society. And if they want to develop in their own residential areas, that's fine too. Like we have the people living in the north, the Innu, they develop on their own. And the people in British Columbia, they develop on their own. They have their own school systems and so on. But the governments of each province will allow that, and the federal government gives that opportunity. So that acknowledgement was something that I, as an individual, respect of being on the land of the Indigenous people. Because whoever came to Canada, they don't own the land. They either were born here, yes, but they don't own the land. The land is still Turtle Island, period.
Great. Thank you very much, Jay. Let's hear from Dr. Bala now. Yes, you're unmuted. But you're not audible as yet. Dr. Bala? We can see you, but we're not hearing you.
So,
You would probably need to press, there's a little speaker close to your shirt collar. You may need to press that.
Mouthpiece.
Yeah, the mouthpiece of your headset. Yes. Can you press that?
So
Okay,
we
just say hello to us. Sorry, Dr. Mahathir. Just say hello to us. Let's see if we can get you. No, we're not getting you.
So yeah, we'll move on to Keisha V and then Shepard.
Perhaps
and
Robin
then-
can give him a call and help with that.
Yeah, I'll send it. Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Bala, we'll ask Robin to give you a call. Thank you. So MK, go ahead, please. Can you unmute? Mohammed Keshavji. Please
Yes.
unmute.
Sorry, I missed
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Thank
That's-
you, Shalima.
That's
Can you hear me?
yes.
First of all, I'd like to compliment you for getting such outstanding people with such a range of experience to speak on the issue. And I think I would just make a few very short points. Being a lawyer myself, though not a constitutional lawyer, but one very interested in this whole field over a 50-year close connection with how diasporic Indians have had to fare. We have 19 million Indians across the Indian diaspora of the 19th century. I'm not talking of the recent arrivals from India or Pakistan or wherever. And I think we need to take into consideration that Indians in those 19 areas are living on a historical fault line. Whether we like it or not, historically, we have been placed in a position where in each one of those countries, there are complex issues. And I think this is where we need to come to grips with the constitution rethinking process in a very creative way, because there are inherited inequities, there are inherited prejudices, there are systemic inequities, there are problems with discrepancies on majority-minority situations. In East Africa, we were a minority with a large black majority, and we said, oh, only if we had more people, we'd be okay. And then you go to the Caribbean, and I ask people like Kumar and David Dabadin that you people are a majority, what happened? But it depends now how your identity is defined, with what closer affinity. Is it the Caribbean, in which the Indians look like minorities? Because there's a Caribbean culture which is much stronger. So your cultural rights are implicated. The whole idea of saying every time there is some looting to do, the Indians suffer first. Why is that? So I think we need what I would call creative constitutional reformation. We have to take into consideration all the convention principles, but I think we need much greater creativity. And here I would suggest to all of you and to our constitutional thinkers that please look at L.B. Sex's lecture in Toronto at the Global Center of Pluralism, in which he spoke how the South African Constitution was thought of immediately after apartheid. I think that's an absolutely brilliant presentation, and I would strongly recommend it, number one. Number two, Mr. Kusha Harak Singh so beautifully outlined that a preamble is important, but any preamble has to be seriously adhered to. If we use constitutions instrumentally, which most nations do today, and there is that struggle between the judiciary and the legislature in most countries. I mean, let's be very practical that most of the democratic countries are going through difficulties today, including the United Kingdom. And I think it's important that we look at our preamble very carefully and then look at those three principles that Kusha Haraksan spoke about. Who makes the law? Who implements the law? Who interprets the law? And I think that is very critical, particularly when you're on a fault line, and those who implement the law could perhaps use it for a purpose apart from the very core values for which that law was implemented. Lastly, and this is the point I would make, that any constitutional reform has to take into account the diversity of the demographics, the pluralistic vision, a genuine vision of pluralism. And unfortunately, we don't see this in many constitutions today. Very, very few countries, I think. If I'm not wrong, I think Singapore was one of the countries that did respect the question of meritocracy, diversity, and pluralism. And I think we should ensure that any constitution does not otherize people on the basis of race, religion, gender, and not to weaponize those principles in order to smoke people out of the whole process. We need inclusivity, we need respect for differences, and then we need to understand what does the preamble say about what the Constitution can promote in terms of belonging, in terms of identity, and in terms of contributing. And I rest my case on those 3 points. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Harak Singh, would you like to reply?
Only to thank the last speaker for his comments. He's quite right in emphasizing the role of the preamble. I think if we can get that right, then we'll get a lot of other things in the Constitution itself right. So it's not something to be glossed over, but something to be fought over, actually. How do you frame that introductory statement?
Very good. Thank you very much. Can we have Professor Vereen Shepherd?
Thank you very much. I apologize that my camera isn't on. Sorry. Yes, I was apologizing. My camera is a bit iffy at the moment. But I want to first of all thank the organizers for such a wonderful panel. I learned so much from listening. The second thing I wanted to say is that I was very, very happy to hear the land recognition, the start with the land recognition from our panelists from Canada. And to say that, as some of us know, the University of the West Indies has an annual Toronto Gala, a fundraising gala for the University of the West Indies. And I think 3 years ago, they started to introduce the activity by land recognition in Canada. And I was pleased that they asked me to actually do the land recognition. And well, I wasn't there. I don't go, but I did a video recording of the land recognition, and I'm told it's played every year at the Toronto Gala. So I was really happy to see our university coming in line. But the third thing I want to say is that I've been trying to lobby the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies and the regional headquarters to start our own events with a land recognition. I think we forget that the Caribbean was not always ours, you know, that the land we occupy actually belonged to a variety of indigenous peoples. In Trinidad and Tobago, you know very well the groups that are still there, the descendants are still there. And so that those of us who have influence on in our various campuses of the UA, I think should start to get this within our system to ensure that we don't go on as if we were the first people to inhabit this space. And also I wanted to ask my colleague and friend Dr. Harak Singh something quickly. If you were to advise Jamaica to avoid one thing in the constitutional change, as we have a constitutional commission, trying to move towards a republic. If you were to say one thing to avoid because of the experience of Trinidad and Tobago, what would that be? And secondly, I wanted to ask you, why is it within the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, citizenship by marriage for women is so difficult? As you know, I'm married to a Trinidadian man, and but I haven't been able to get citizenship, dual citizenship. I don't know if things have changed now. But when I checked ages ago, Trinidad and Tobago said that a woman who is married to a Trinidadian man had to live in Trinidad and Tobago for 7 years and not work. And Kusha, you can't imagine me living for 7 years and not work to support to help to support my family. So I wondered, why is it the Constitution? Is it the Constitution? Is it just practice? What is it that, and has anything changed where that is concerned? And if you don't know, maybe you look it up for me and tell me later on. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Dr. Harak Singh.
Yeah, Verena, I will have to look it up, but I think part of the problem might be the treatment of dual citizenship, which Trinidad doesn't really allow. I don't think it has to do with some plot not to make you a Trinidadian or not to grant you citizenship, but I promise to look it up for you. As to your first question, what is the one thing that I would ask the Jamaicans to avoid in their constitution? Well, I would say, given the history of Jamaica, it's likely that in the years going forward, that the elections will always be won by small margins. And I therefore think that there should be some kind of arrangement, which we do have in Trinidad, and which I was part of actually when I was a member of parliament, a law which we passed called the Crossing of the Floor Act, which was meant to ensure that if you were elected by a particular party and you left that party and went over the floor to the other side, you should actually vacate your seat and fight a by-election. Because if you're going to have majorities which are very slim, you're likely to run into trouble that I describe as elite seduction. That is, some people who will stay in the background, and when the time is ripe, they might offer to buy one or two members of parliament, and in so doing might in fact buy the whole government. This is why we had the Crossing of the Floor bill in Trinidad. And mind you, when I made that speech when I was a member of parliament at the time, I was accused as Dr. Aya said, of tinkering with the Constitution, of not respecting the fact that constitutions must not be changed willy-nilly. But mind you, that whole arrangement of crossing the floor, the Indian High Commissioner to Trinidad followed the debate, and he sent our speeches back home to India, and India eventually passed such a floor. It's called the Anti-Defection Bill, which actually works in the assemblies in India to stop people from crossing from one party or the other, and so bringing down whole governments. So I think there must be something in the Constitution to prevent the bringing down of an entire government in a situation in which the majority might be 3 or 4 or 5 after the elections take place. That is what I would advise.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Terrific. So, Professor Vereen Shepherd, the man who could possibly assist you with getting dual citizenship or finding out what is the situation in terms of the Constitution is with us. He's ready now. This is Mr. Nizam Mohammed. So I'm going to reintroduce him, and I'll ask those of you with your hands up, Dr. Bala, Dr. Indira, Dr. Winford James, please, let's give our final speaker the opportunity to present, and then we will ask you to ask your questions if you don't mind. Thank you very much. So ladies and gentlemen, let me reintroduce Mr. Nizam Mohammed. He is an 83-year-old London-educated lawyer still in practice for more than 5 decades, a former member of parliament, as well as a speaker of our House of Representatives. Recently, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago announced that he will serve in the National Advisory Committee to make recommendations for constitutional change and in preparation for that national consultation in June. So welcome, Mr. Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Shalima. I want to apologize for my almost non-arrival on your program. Technical difficulties on my end, which I personally cannot handle. So I'm extremely sorry. Let me, for the few minutes that I have, I had planned to speak for the time allotted to me about the founding principles of our constitution in Trinidad and Tobago vis-a-vis the diaspora, more particularly the Indo content of population, particularly in the West. Unfortunately, I think I have to veer away from that completely. And I really did not want to intervene at this stage to interfere or obstruct in any way the follow-up discussions that have been taking place. However, let me say that it is a wonderful program that you all have actually executed today, and completely off from what I had intended to say. It brings to mind that, or rather, we have to bear in mind that we have in the diaspora, we have come from India, and India on its own has been a country with leadership in many spheres on the international scene, whether we accept that or not. But I think that that is a fact. And looking at constitutions, we go back to the most difficult challenge, one of the most difficult challenges that India had in its early days to bring about a constitution in order to form a nation bereft of the imperial colonial masters. And it was quite a struggle, which perhaps we may have taken for granted outside of Trinidad and Tobago, outside of India. And what comes to mind is the serious development that took place in Uganda in 1972, when Asians, and more particularly people of Indian origin, were given a very limited time by a very cruel dictator, Idi Amin, to get out of their country, which meant, and which actually means, that these people had absolutely no protection of the law when that happened. Also, the kind of laws that existed in South Africa during apartheid would again speak to that point, that the laws were not there to protect not only the Black people who were bearing the brunt of apartheid, but also Indians who had originally come from India and settled in South Africa. We have had some upheavals in the 60s here in the Caribbean, in Guyana as well, where we have a sizable population of people who have whose ancestors had come from India. So that we must not forget where we have come from. And what I tend to observe, and I do not know whether other panelists will agree with me, is the fact that we as a people of the diaspora, while we fit in nicely in wherever we have settled, whether we have come from indentureship or whether we have come as migrants out of India, we take for granted what we have met and what governs the various societies in which we live. And to me, that is a serious mistake that we are making. We had this champion of the oppressed during the early days of independence in India, Bhimji Rao Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar was the one who fought for the oppressed. But in India, what was peculiar to India was the caste system. And he, coming from amongst the Dalits or the untouchables, he has gone down in history as being not only the foremost fighter for the people who were marginalized, but also as the architect, the chief architect of the Indian Constitution as it exists today. He had said that if the Indians leave India, wherever they go, there is going to be, we will be having problems, meaning that those who are in the diaspora today will be experiencing some measure of inequality and social challenges. And that is something that we ought to remember. He was a gentleman. I think we in the Indian diaspora, we should acquaint ourselves with the teachings and the positions that Dr. Ambedkar had taken and be more vigilant in ensuring that we make a contribution to shape the societies in which we live. And as we all know, and it has been said time and time again on this very program, that the Constitution is the foundation and the supreme law of all the lands and democracies where we live. And it is the piece of legislation that guarantees us our basic freedoms and our human rights, etc., etc., etc. So that in present times, we can actually witness that there are struggles for equality, whether it is in the United States of America, in Canada, as our friend from Mississauga was telling us, whether it is in the Caribbean or Fiji or wherever, it is the same situation. And this very popular Indian writer, Arundhati Roy, she was one of those who was very vocal about this situation in India and the kind of contribution that Dr. Ambedkar had made. I know we are running out of time, and we do not. I cannot develop the point, but
Mr.
she was one
Mohammed,
of those.
Mr.
Yes,
Mohammed,
I beg your
it's
pardon.
okay. It's okay. We can go over by about 10 minutes today. Please continue.
Yes, I was trying to find something that the author, this lady Arundhati Roy, had said something very, 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 very instructive for us during this this discussion. Unfortunately, I cannot come to it at the moment, but suffice it to say, Shalima, that we are in Trinidad and Tobago, as you indicated to our participants. I am on a committee looking at the at the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, and to advise the government on the question as to where we go from here. And we have had a review of our commission attempts, I would say, in 1974, in 1986, in 1991, and even in 2010. And all the attempts never brought any kind of meaningful change, except we have tinkered with our constitution from time to time. And one of the regrettable things about this whole situation is that the population in general, I know that the man in the street cannot write a constitution. It requires people with the technical knowledge for drafting and doing up such a document. But we seem to be unable, as countries that have come out of colonialism and are independent, we seem incapable of understanding the fundamental, the importance of a fundamental document as a constitution. And that is something that bothers me quite a lot. And it is something that I think that we should address. That is to say, what do we do to get our people interested in the business of governance and the matters that allow for the reinforcement of democratic practices and democratic principles. I'm sorry if I have sounded a little bit disjointed, but as I say, matters of these technical matters have really affected my participation and my contribution to your program. I want to thank you again for having me. Perhaps at another time, things may not work out as they did on this occasion.
No need to apologize at all. We absolutely appreciate what you've come up with. And this is off the top of your head, it would seem, but this is why we appreciate you. And this is why we needed to have this discussion today. I'm going to ask Dr. Balasubramanian Chandra Mohan to raise his points. And one of the reasons why we insist that he speaks, he's a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in the School of Advanced Study at the University of London and has extensive experience with Commonwealth. So go ahead, please, Dr. Bala.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll be brief. I've got 2 points to make. One is to what extent, say, like, for example, membership of an organization impacts on the constitution of an individual country or individual nation state. Say, for example, for example, a country like Malta or Cyprus, or till recently UK, were members of both EU as well as the Commonwealth. The EU is a treaty-based organization, and Commonwealth is a non-treaty organization. And now, to what extent belonging to this would require constitutional changes if they are not in keeping with this, and if they belong to multiple regional or transnational or regional organizations, including, for example, the CARICOM, would that require significant constitutional change? And if it is, how can that be achieved without significant disruption to the other principles that were discussed so far? My second point is, again, following on from Dr. Nizam, it might be one way of influencing or making or generating greater interest in terms of diasporic contribution as well as diasporic experience, might be to come up with an index, a diasporic democracy index, or whatever name you would like to call it, which would then have countries, irrespective whether they are Francophonie or in the Commonwealth, come up with a certain common features or common contributions that the diaspora has made, and that could generate a certain table, and that table could generate some interest at an individual nation level as well, because they would then be able to compare and see how they have contributed across the Commonwealth or across the other regions. It was very gratifying to note that the anti-defection bill in India had in some ways a root in Trinidad, in the way a rule that was passed in Trinidad could then transfer across to another Commonwealth country. So the 2 points, that belonging to another transnational organization, does it affect the national constitution? And if so, how would be make sure that the conflict is minimized. And the second is the idea that we could have an index of democracy within different Commonwealth, different diasporic communities and countries where these communities are based. Thanks.
Thank you very much. The index of diasporic index with common features. Mr. Mohammed, would you like to respond?
Not really, except that I continue to think that the diaspora has not been able to have any common thread in that would keep us together and to help us to have something in common so that we can be heard if needs be, with some measure of authority when we speak. And it is not like in India, where the focus by Dr. Ambedkar was on the Dalits and the untouchables. But in the West, for example, we have the Sikhs are struggling for equality outside of India. We have been having situations where the discrimination and the inequality that people are experiencing. You have developments in the United States, where people from India who originated from India, they are coming together and they are having issues that they are voicing publicly. In the UK, it's the same thing. Our friend who resides in Ireland, one of our contributors, he would know this as well, that in the UK, you have the same situation. As a matter of fact, it started in India, that ended up in the division of India between India and Pakistan. Even amongst the Muslims, you have all kinds of subsets or sects all over the world today, so that it is more a matter of different interest groups within the overall group that originated, that we have all these challenges that are taking place. And constitutions, to my mind, are critically important, and the development on a continuing basis, the development of constitutions to meet modern societal needs is an imperative that we have to address and get people interested in. Hello?
Yes.
So that's my response to my friend who spoke before me.
Right. Thank you very much. So I think you just echoed something that Dr. Iyer would have raised, which is that we need to look at whether a constitution should be flexible or not. And I think you're calling for that degree of flexibility.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Let's hear now from Dr. Indira Rampasad.
Hi, Shalima. Good evening, and good evening, colleagues, friends there in the panel and out in the audience. So I'm listening intently, and I really enjoyed all the contributions from the panelists. I've been planning to do one at UE as well, because it is the week that we have to submit to the government. I think by the 15th of April, they've been calling for contributions. But I want to just raise this issue, two issues of political will and lack of confidence. and lack of confidence, both from the politicians in themselves and in each other, and lack of confidence from the population. The Westminster system on which, of politics, which the Constitution came into, is also part of the problem, part of the systemic and structural problem we have, this whole notion of winner takes it all. We would recall that we had some attempts under the People's Partnership to review the Constitution, to bring constitutional reform, and it went through the Parliament, and I think it was stuck in the Senate, and they were talking about the right of recall of non-performing parliamentarians, and fixed dates for election, fixed terms for elections, and that didn't go through. And that had to do with the lack of confidence amongst the politicians themselves against each other. So I wonder if we're spinning top in mud, because it's been tried and tested and it's not going through in some ways, especially when the politicians think for some reason it's going to impact negatively on their power. So we speak into the power dynamic. The lack of confidence as well. Dr. Haraksing spoke about the Crossing of the Floor Act. Some others picked it up. But the Crossing of the Floor Act was passed, Dr. Haraksing, but the standing orders were not amended for it to be implemented. So that the Crossing of the Floor Act has not really been, enacted so that it could be implemented, so that we still have politicians who can be on hire purchase by other political parties. And I like to use the term hire purchase with the Crossing of the Floor Act. So some most constitutional reform measures would require a special majority, that is 2/3 or 3/4. And the other side tend to always oppose. So whichever government is in power, the other side oppose. So that is why I raised the issue initially about lack of political will. But the people looking on at this are also very worried, because the politicians play the card, whether it's a political card or an ethnic card, whatever card they have to play, to ensure that the population is bought into whatever position they are trying to sell. So they will, while it may seem so ostensibly, I think, and Dr. Haraksing hit it on the nail on the head, when it comes to implementation and the impact of the implementation, they start weighing the pros and cons of those implications politically. They will tend to disappear or dissipate. So I just wanted to make those points, that we could be continuing to spin top in mud. I hate to be negative, not negative by nature, but we could continue to spin top in mud, go around in circles, unless there is that political will, unless there is confidence and cooperation amongst the politicians themselves, which we know can hardly happen in adversarial Westminster politics, and unless the people themselves can buy into it and not swallow everything that the politicians are throwing at them. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you raised some very interesting points there, Indira, and I think one of the biggest issues that we have is wondering whether or not this whole National Advisory Committee is really just politicking. We really would like this to be taken seriously.
May I?
Certainly, sir. Certainly.
Yes. Just one point that Indira made. The Crossing of the Floor Act was it was refined and completed. As a matter of fact, it is in effect. I think it was one politician, Volney. I think Volney had crossed the floor or something like that, and he lost his seat, if I recall correctly. So the Crossing of the Floor Act is now active law, so to speak. On the point of the collective will of the people, to what extent we can get that. The Westminster system militates against that. I agree with Indira on that point. But if the other one is this, we see a kind of paralysis that is setting in if we are to be subjective, in Trinidad and Tobago. And we know, all the politicians know, that there is need for us to look at the Constitution in a serious way. And it is mere propaganda now, or rather convenient propaganda, that the National Advisory Council, of which I am a committee, of which I am a member, it is about politicking. I believe that there has been endless calls for constitutional reform in Trinidad and Tobago, and this government, in the wake of the passing of Mr. Pandey, followed up on that. And it is a sad day for our country for people to feel that it is politicking. I tell you where the politicking is. The fact of the matter is that one, the governing political party has initiated yet, or rather, is making yet another attempt at constitutional reform, the fifth or the sixth one since independence. And others are saying if there is any success in that regard, it will make that party, the governing party, look good. They're not thinking that it will be giving us an opportunity to start afresh or to build on something that can be more viable, because we need to accept the fact, recognize that a country's laws must of necessity be abreast of social developments, and time has run out on Trinidad and Tobago, and that is why, because of a lack of the proper rules of government, we have a new kind of political party that is springing up in the country that is called the criminal gangs. And if the country does not want to accept that and does not want to recognize that and do something about that, well, then chaos will follow, unfortunately. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we have indeed gone 10 minutes over our time. And so it is that time when we need to close today's program officially and end the recording. I will ask you, though, to please hold where you are if you still would like to make a contribution. Dr. Winford James, I know your hand was up and you didn't get an opportunity to ask your question. Your hand is down, but we will still ask if you would like to do so. And at this point in time, I want to say thank you very, very much to all of our speakers today. Mr. Jairam Nair, Dr. Kusha Harak Singh, Mr. Nizam Mohammed, and Dr. Venkat Iyer. Your contributions were extremely important to us. We so appreciate it. We appreciate your time and expertise as well. Thank you all for being here. I'll turn you all over now to Shakira to formally close today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalama, and thank you to all who contributed and for their sacrifice for being here, for giving freely of their time, experience, your knowledge, and your expertise. And we want to thank all the members of our audience on Zoom and on YouTube for attending and participating. So as we said earlier, this public meeting is being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, and you can feel free to contact the ICC to publish your books and reports. And remember that we are kindly asking to give your suggestions, as well as be volunteers and donate, and you can contact Dr. Mahabir for details. We want to thank the advisory and planning team led by Dr. Kumar Mahabir, and to our IT manager behind the scenes, Ravin Ram Singh, who has been recording the program and will upload it to our website and to YouTube permanently for posterity, and to Miriam Mohammed for producing our TikTok videos. Our topic next Sunday will be the continuation of conversations with elders in the Indian diaspora. So please visit our YouTube channel to see all our past recordings. I am Shakira Mohammed from Trinidad saying goodbye. May God bless you all. Dhanyavad.